Emily Carter did not plan to step outside the ballroom. It happened quietly, almost without thought. One moment she was standing beside a tall table, holding a glass of water and smiling when someone spoke to her. The next moment she was walking toward the exit doors, drawn by the need to breathe. The company dinner was elegant and loud. Soft music played under steady chatter. Plates clinked. Laughter rose and fell. People talked about promotions, projects, and future plans. Everyone seemed busy proving they belonged there. Emily felt like a guest in someone else's life. She pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the cool evening air. The hotel stood in downtown Toronto, surrounded by glowing buildings and moving traffic. The city felt alive, restless, confident. Emily wrapped her arms around herself and let out a slow breath. Inside, her husband Mark was still talking. He was always talking at events like this, telling stories, making connections, nodding at the right moments. He looked comfortable there, like he had found his place. Emily once believed she was part of that place too. She checked her phone. No new messages. Emily leaned against the stone wall near the entrance and stared up at the sky, which was hidden by lights and tall glass towers. She remembered earlier years when dinners like this felt exciting. When Mark would squeeze her hand and whisper jokes. When he would look for her in a crowded room. Now, they moved through rooms separately. The door opened again behind her. Stepped out for air. A calm voice asked. Emily turned. Daniel Wright stood a few feet away, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. He looked the same as always, neat, composed, unreadable. Mark S. Boss. A man who never raised his voice and never wasted words. Yes, Emily said. It got a bit warm inside. Daniel nodded. It does. They stood in silence. It was not uncomfortable, but it was noticeable. Daniel looked toward the street, not at her, as if giving her space. Emily appreciated that. I hope the dinner wasn't too dull, he said. Emily smiled faintly. It was fine. The truth was more complicated, but she didn't expect him to ask. People rarely did. Daniel checked his watch. Mark mentioned he might stay late. There's a small group discussing next quarter's plans. Emily felt a familiar tightness. She had heard versions of that sentence many times. Meetings after meetings. Talks that could not wait. I see, she said. If you'd like, Daniel added, I can give you a ride home. It's on my way. The words surprised her. Not because they were inappropriate, but because they were direct and kind. Emily hesitated. She didn't want to look awkward or needy. But she also didn't want to stand alone outside a hotel waiting for a husband who might forget time. That would be helpful, she said. They walked to the parking garage together. Their footsteps echoed softly. Emily noticed how Daniel kept a polite distance, opening the car door for her without comment. He waited until she was seated before getting in himself. The car smelled clean, faintly of leather and coffee. The engine hummed as they pulled out into traffic. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Emily watched the city slide past the window. Streetlights blurred into long lines of gold. She felt tired in a deep way, the kind that came from holding things in for too long. You seemed quiet tonight. Daniel said at last. She almost laughed. I suppose I am. Long day. He asked. Long year, she answered before she could stop herself. Daniel didn't react. He didn't push. He just nodded once, slowly. The traffic slowed. A red light caught them at an intersection. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel. Events like these can be draining, he said, especially when you're not sure where you fit. Emily turned slightly toward him. His tone was gentle, not curious. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. That's true, she said. They continued driving. The silence felt different, now less empty, more aware. Emily felt seen in a way she had not expected. It made her uneasy, but also calm. Daniel turned onto her street. The houses were quiet, their windows glowing softly. He slowed the car and parked near the curb. Before she reached for the door, Daniel spoke again. I hope this doesn't sound strange, he said, but I wanted to say something. Emily paused. Okay. You matter, he said, even when people forget to show it. The words landed gently, but they stayed. Emily felt a rush of emotion she hadn't prepared for. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Thank you, she finally said. Daniel smiled once, brief and respectful. Good night, Emily. She stepped out of the car and walked toward her house. She didn't look back. Inside, the lights were off. The house felt still. Emily locked the door and leaned against it. Her heart wasn't racing. It felt steady, thoughtful, confused. She changed into comfortable clothes and sat at the kitchen table. The clock ticked loudly. She thought about Daniel's words, about the way he said them without asking for anything in return. Mark came home much later. He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly and went upstairs, already talking about work. Emily listened, nodded, and said nothing. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily stared at the ceiling. She realized the shock wasn't the ride home. The shock was being reminded of herself. The night after the company dinner, Emily Carter couldn't sleep. Her thoughts circled around Daniel Wright's words, simple, gentle words that had unsettled her more than she expected. You matter. The car ride replayed in her mind again and again. She could still hear the quiet certainty in his voice. The way he had spoken without judgment, without expectation, and yet somehow with more honesty than she had felt in years. Mark's presence in the house that evening was distant as usual. He was tired, distracted, scrolling through his phone while half listening to her brief updates about the day. Emily tried to smile, tried to match his energy, but it felt empty. She felt alone in her own home, even when he was there. The contrast between the warmth she had felt in Daniel's simple attention and the cold routine of her own marriage was sharper than she cared to admit. Days passed, and Emily carried Daniel's words quietly with her. She tried to focus on her work, on her home, on Mark, but everything seemed muted. During breakfast, she noticed how Mark always spoke in fragments. His mind elsewhere, barely noticing the small details of her life, how her coffee was too hot, how the morning sunlight hit her hair, the little hesitations in her speech that went unheard. Emily began to realize she had been invisible for a long time, and Daniel's words had cracked open a part of her she didn't know could still feel. The following week, another company event brought her into Daniel's presence again. It was smaller, less formal, a morning seminar that ended in coffee and light conversation. Emily hadn't expected to see him, and yet there he was, calm, approachable, standing in the corner while everyone else chatted. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt a jolt of recognition, something unspoken passed between them. A quiet understanding. Danielle approached her after the seminar. Careful, polite. Emily, he said softly, I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable the other night. She shook her head quickly. No, you surprised me. She didn't know how to explain that the surprise wasn't in the attention itself, but in the truth of it, in the recognition she hadn't realized she craved. Daniel nodded, looking slightly relieved. Then I should explain. I wasn't speaking as your husband's boss. I was speaking as someone who once lost a marriage by not paying attention. I recognized the silence, the kind that makes people doubt their worth. Emily's heart skipped. The words were personal, but not threatening. They were honest, reflective, and somehow freeing. She wanted to respond, but the right words wouldn't come. She only nodded, her chest tightening with recognition. For a moment they stood quietly. The room buzzed around them, yet they were in a bubble where nothing else existed. Emily realized she was holding her breath. She had never spoken to anyone like this, no one who could see her without judging, without asking for anything in return. Daniel smiled faintly, careful not to overstep. I won't blur boundaries, he said, but I hope you remember that you matter. You're worth noticing, Emily. The words lingered long after he walked away. Emily spent the rest of the day in a daze. When she returned home, she didn't immediately see Mark. He arrived later, carrying his usual briefcase, still caught up in work. Emily wanted to speak, but she couldn't find a way to bridge the distance that had been growing for years. That night, lying in bed, Emily realized something fundamental had shifted. Her heart wasn't racing with fear or attraction, it was opening with understanding. Daniel hadn't crossed any lines, hadn't tempted her or intruded into her marriage. He had simply reflected back the truth she had been avoiding. She had been quiet, invisible, and unappreciated. Emily knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to face her feelings about Mark, about herself, about what she wanted from life and from love. The next morning, she made a decision. She would speak honestly, fully, and openly. She couldn't change the past, but she could demand acknowledgement in the present. When Mark returned home from work that evening, Emily was waiting. The house was quiet, the lights soft. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and waited until he noticed her. "Mark," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." He looked up, surprised. "About what?" "About us," she said simply. "About how I've been feeling." Mark's brow furrowed. "Feeling what?" Emily took a deep breath. "I feel invisible sometimes, alone, like I don't matter to you the way I used to. And I can't keep pretending I'm okay with it." For the first time, Mark listened. Really listened. He put down his briefcase, sat across from her, and didn't interrupt. Emily spoke for nearly an hour, explaining the little things, the quiet mornings, the distracted conversations, the nights when she felt unseen. She told him about her doubts, her fears, and the ache that had been growing quietly for years. Mark's expression softened. He admitted he hadn't noticed, hadn't realized how his focus on work and routine had left her feeling distant. For the first time in years, they spoke honestly, without blame, without excuses. They talked about what had changed, what could be fixed, and what needed attention. Emily felt a sense of relief she hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden, but it was real. The quiet understanding she had felt with Daniel had given her the courage to face the truth in her own life. Days turned into weeks. Emily and Mark began small changes, morning coffee together, conversations without distractions, honest expressions of appreciation. Emily noticed a shift in herself as well. She spoke more freely, laughed more often, and allowed herself to be noticed. Daniel remained at the edge of her thoughts, not a source of temptation, but a reminder that her feelings, her worth, her voice mattered. That sometimes change didn't come from drama or conflict, came from a simple recognition of the truth. Emily's life didn't transform overnight. Her marriage was not perfect, but it was waking up from a long sleep. And she realized that sometimes the people who shock us the most aren't those who do something reckless. They those who remind us of what we've been missing. One quiet evening, Emily found herself at the window, looking out at the city lights again. She thought of Daniel and smiled faintly, not because of desire, but because of gratitude. He had reminded her that she deserved to be seen, and that knowledge changed everything in the end. Emily understood that life was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about noticing, listening, and valuing each other. And for the first time in a long time, she felt fully awake, fully aware, and fully alive. The ride home with Daniel had been a simple moment, yet it had sparked the courage to reclaim her own voice. She turned from the window, feeling a quiet strength settle within her. The journey ahead with Mark would take work, patience, and honesty. But she was ready, and that readiness, that small but powerful shift in her heart, was the shock that mattered most. Emily finally slept that night with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, knowing that she had been seen, that she had been heard, and that the most important change was already beginning inside herself.